Picture the scene: a stone platform in the Agora of Corinth, sun beating down on rows of chained men and women. Merchants shout prices, buyers prod at teeth, muscles, backs, checking goods like livestock. Among them stands a man unlike any other, barefoot, cloaked in a torn wool mantle, his beard wild, his eyes utterly calm. He does not slump in shame like the others. He stands upright, almost amused, studying the crowd studying him. This is Diogenes of Sinope, once a free citizen, now cargo. Weeks earlier he had been sailing the Aegean on personal business. Now he is property, about to be sold to the highest bidder. Most men in his position would beg, weep, or collapse into despair. Diogenes does something no one expects. He begins to enjoy himself. The question that will define the rest of his life is about to be asked aloud, in front of a jeering crowd. What, exactly, is this strange man good for? To understand why Diogenes was smiling on that platform, you need to know who he had become. Years earlier, he had been exiled from his home city of Sinope after a financial scandal involving his father, a mint official accused of debasing coinage. Stripped of wealth and status, Diogenes traveled to Athens and did something radical. Instead of trying to rebuild his fortune, he abandoned the entire game. He owned almost nothing. A cloak, a cup, a wooden bowl he eventually smashed after watching a boy drink water from his cupped hands and realizing even the bowl was excess. He slept in a large ceramic storage jar in the marketplace. He begged for food, mocked passing generals, and told Athens' wealthiest citizens exactly what he thought of their gilded cages. He called himself a citizen of the world, loyal to no state, dependent on no possession. To the Athenians, he was an embarrassment. To himself, he was the only truly free man in the city. So when pirates later captured his ship and dragged him towards slavery, Diogenes carried something no chain could touch, an idea about what freedom actually is. The capture itself came suddenly and violently. Diogenes had boarded a ship bound across the Aegean. Accounts differ on his exact business, but the outcome is certain. Pirates struck, as they often did along those trade routes, boarding the vessel with swords drawn, taking cargo and passengers alike. There was no negotiation, no mercy. Free men became merchandise within hours. Diogenes was bound in rope alongside merchants, sailors, and travelers who had done nothing but choose the wrong ship on the wrong day. The pirates did not care that he was a philosopher known throughout Athens for his biting wit and public stunts. To them he was simply another body to sell at the next port. They sailed toward Crete, then onward toward the great slave markets of the Greek world, Corinth chief among them. For most captives, this journey was the end of everything they understood themselves to be: citizen, craftsman, father, free man. For Diogenes, chained below deck in the dark, something else was happening. He was watching, with philosophical curiosity, exactly how a man's spirit behaves when every external marker of status is stripped away in an instant. By the time the ship reached Corinth, Diogenes had already made peace with his situation in a way that unsettled even his captors. Slave traders were used to two kinds of prisoners: those who wept and pleaded, hoping for a lighter sentence, and those who raged, hoping for an early death. Diogenes did neither. He observed the market with the detached curiosity of a man watching a play rather than living inside a catastrophe. He asked questions of the guards. He commented on the architecture of the auction platform. He even critiqued the pricing strategy of a fellow trader selling cloth 2 stalls down. This behavior baffled his handlers. Was this arrogance, madness, or something else entirely? What none of them yet understood was that Diogenes had spent years training himself precisely for a moment like this. His whole philosophy, later known as cynicism, was built on one relentless question: if you strip away wealth, reputation, comfort, and status, what is actually left of a person? Now, standing in chains awaiting sale, he was about to answer that question not in words but in front of a live audience. The bidding began with the ordinary theater of any slave market. An auctioneer called out the virtues of each captive: strength for laborers, beauty for household servants, skill for craftsmen. Buyers walked the line, inspecting hands for calluses, backs for scars, teeth for health, exactly as they would inspect a horse or an ox. When they reached Diogenes, the mood shifted. He did not lower his eyes. He did not offer his arms for inspection. Instead, he looked directly back at each buyer who approached him, studying them with the same clinical interest they were using to study him. Whispers spread through the crowd. "Who is this insolent one?" Someone recognized him. The famous eccentric from Athens, the man who lived in a jar, who had once been seen walking through the agora in broad daylight carrying a lit lamp, claiming he was searching for an honest man. Laughter rippled through the market. The auctioneer, sensing an opportunity for spectacle, decided to ask Diogenes directly what skill he could offer a buyer, half expecting mockery, half expecting silence born of humiliation. "What can you do?" the auctioneer asked, loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear, expecting the usual answer: cooking, weaving, farming, some trade that justified a price. Diogenes considered the question seriously, as if it were the most important question anyone had ever asked him. Then he answered, "I know how to govern men." The crowd erupted in laughter. A chained, half-starved philosopher, dirt under his nails, claiming he could govern anyone, let alone free citizens who had come to buy him. It seemed the perfect punchline to a market day joke. But Diogenes was not finished. Scanning the crowd, he pointed toward a well-dressed man standing near the front, a wealthy Corinthian named Xeniades, clearly a person of means and comfort. "Sell me to that man," Diogenes said. "He needs a master." The words landed like a slap. It was not a plea for mercy. It was a diagnosis. Diogenes was declaring, in front of the entire market, that the truly enslaved were not always the ones standing in chains. Sometimes they were the ones holding the purse, ruled entirely by appetite, status, and fear of losing what they owned. Xeniades, to his credit, did not storm off in outrage. Something in the audacity of the answer intrigued him. Here was a man with nothing, no coin, no land, no status, standing in bonds, speaking to a wealthy free citizen as though he were the one in need of rescue. Xeniades stepped forward and purchased Diogenes on the spot, perhaps as a curiosity, perhaps as a joke to entertain dinner guests, perhaps sensing that this strange philosopher might be worth more than his price. Word of the exchange spread quickly through Corinth. People repeated the line in taverns and courtyards. The slave told his buyer that his buyer needed a master. It was the kind of story that traveled fast precisely because it inverted the natural order everyone assumed was fixed, that the man with the money holds the power and the man in chains has none. Diogenes had just demonstrated something else entirely, that power over one's own mind, one's own judgments, one's own reactions, could not be bought, sold, or chained, no matter what the law recorded on a bill of sale. Life in the Xeniades household did not unfold the way anyone expected a master-slave relationship to unfold. Diogenes was given the task of tutoring Xeniades' two young sons, and he treated the assignment with total seriousness, but on his own terms. He taught them to ride horses bareback, to endure discomfort without complaint, to fetch their own food and carry their own water rather than relying on servants for every small task. He taught them rhetoric and philosophy in the mornings and physical endurance in the afternoons, insisting that a mind trained without a disciplined body was only half-formed. The boys adored him. More strikingly, Xeniades himself began deferring to Diogenes on household matters, consulting him before making decisions, treating his opinion as more valuable than that of any hired steward. Visitors to the house noted with amusement, and sometimes discomfort, that the supposed slave seemed to run the household while the supposed master increasingly followed his guidance. Diogenes never asked for freedom papers. He never petitioned for release. He appeared entirely unconcerned with his legal status because he had already answered, for himself, the only question that mattered. One evening, the tension beneath this unusual arrangement finally surfaced. Xeniades, half in jest and half in genuine confusion, asked Diogenes directly how he could be so at ease serving in another man's house, given how fiercely independent he had always claimed to be in Athens. Was this not a contradiction? Diogenes reportedly answered with a question of his own. Would a skilled physician be any less a physician if he happened to be treating a patient inside someone else's home? Would a ship's helmsman lose his mastery of the seas simply because the vessel belonged to another man? His body, he explained, had been bought. His labor could be directed, but his judgments, his opinions, his capacity to reason clearly about what mattered and what didn't, these had never been for sale, because they were never Xeniades' to purchase in the first place. He worked willingly, taught earnestly, and lived simply not because he was commanded to, but because that was already how he chose to live, chains or no chains. Xeniades fell silent. It was the kind of silence that follows a man realizing he has been outmatched, not in status, but in freedom itself. Over time, Xeniades stopped introducing Diogenes as his slave and began introducing him, half proudly, as his household philosopher, the man who taught his sons how to live. Guests who dined at the house left with strange stories to tell. of a servant who spoke more boldly than his master, who criticized wealthy visitors to their faces for their vanity and excess, who was never once punished for insolence because Xeniades had come to value his honesty above his obedience. Some accounts suggest Xeniades eventually offered Diogenes his freedom outright, and that Diogenes, remarkably, showed little urgency in accepting it, content instead to remain, teaching, provoking, living exactly as he pleased inside a household that had originally purchased him as property. The paradox had fully inverted itself. The man bought at auction had become, in every meaningful sense but the legal one, the true head of the household's moral and intellectual life. Corinthians who once laughed at the ragged philosopher on the auction block now sent their own sons to be tutored under his supervision, hoping some of that strange, unshakable independence might rub off on their children as well. Diogenes carried this same unshaken posture for the rest of his life, regardless of circumstance. Later stories, whether fully accurate or embellished by admirers, describe him meeting Alexander the Great himself and refusing to rise from where he sat sunning himself, unbothered by the presence of the most powerful man alive. Whether that particular meeting happened exactly as told matters less than the consistency of the character it reveals. A man for whom external power, whether held by a king, a buyer, or fortune itself, simply did not register as a threat to his inner state. He died, by most accounts, an old man still living according to his own principles, still provoking, still teaching by example rather than lecture. He left no written system, no formal school with tuition and structure. What he left instead was a living demonstration, performed most vividly on that auction block in Corinth, that a person's essential freedom is not granted by law, birth, or wealth, but constructed daily through the discipline of one's own judgments. Slavery, he showed, could be imposed on the body. It could never be imposed on a mind that had already decided what it would and would not surrender. It's worth pausing on how strange this story remains, even now. We tend to assume that freedom is something done to us or for us, granted by governments, employers, circumstances, bank balances. Diogenes never denied that chains, poverty, and hardship were real and painful. He simply refused to let them dictate the one territory he considered non-negotiable, his own capacity to judge, to choose his attitude, to decide what deserved his respect and what deserved his laughter. That distinction, between what happens to us and how we metabolize it, will later become a cornerstone of Stoic philosophy as well, echoed centuries afterward by thinkers who studied exactly this kind of resilience. But Diogenes arrived at it first, and more theatrically, on a slave auction block, laughing while chained, because he understood something most people spend a lifetime avoiding. Dignity is not a possession that can be confiscated. It is a practice, renewed daily, regardless of who currently holds the paperwork on your circumstances. So what does any of this mean for a life lived 2,000 years later, far from auction blocks and Corinthian markets? Most of us will never be sold into slavery, but nearly all of us will face situations where circumstances feel entirely out of our control. A job lost without warning, a diagnosis, a relationship ending, a decision made about our lives by someone else's hand. The instinct in those moments is to measure our freedom by how much control we've lost. Diogenes offers a different measurement entirely. Freedom is not the absence of constraint, but the presence of an unshaken inner judgment about what those constraints mean. Today, try this small exercise. Identify one situation currently pressing on you that you did not choose and cannot immediately change. Instead of asking how to escape it, ask instead, what is still entirely mine to decide here, my attitude, my honesty, my next action? That question, asked seriously and answered honestly, is the same one a chained philosopher asked himself on a stone platform in Corinth, moments before he made his own buyer boat something he could never purchase.